Good evening. It's Monday, the 19th of February. Our top stories tonight. Fierce tribal violence is taking over Papua New Guinea's highlands, with dozens killed in an ambush. Israel says it'll launch an offensive on Rafah next month unless all hostages are freed. Waves of arrests in Russia at events marking the death of Alexei Navalny. And Oppenheimer cleans up at the BAFTAs, claiming 7 awards. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverley O'Connor. Later, the artists working through the night to make Rio de Janeiro a brighter place. Well, there are calls tonight for Australian intervention in Papua New Guinea's highlands after nearly 50 people were killed in a tribal fighting massacre. It's believed to be the largest of its kind in recent history, marking another escalation of tribal violence that's become more and more deadly as firearms become more available. And just a warning, PNG correspondent Tim Swanston's report does contain confronting images and details.
Tribal violence in PNG escalates to devastating and despairing new heights. Hundreds look on as police and defence recover bodies strewn across the highway and the hillside. Nearly 50 people, tribesmen and mercenaries, were killed, believed to be ambushed on their way to carry out an attack.
The enemy said they gotten wind of their movement and were waiting for them. When they came, they got them into a trap.
This attack, believed to be the largest massacre in the highlands in recent history, has sent shockwaves through the country.
I'm deeply moved by this. I'm very concerned. I'm very angry.
Larger numbers of both police and defence have been stationed in Enga since tribal fighting last year killed dozens. It's a traditional practice, sometimes fought over political lines, but it's been made all the more deadly in recent years through greater access to firearms.
This type of carnage is only made possible through the use of many small arms.
PNG's Police Commissioner has described the attack as domestic terrorism. Engan Governor Sir Peter Ipatas has renewed his calls for Australian intervention, including boots on the ground. Although unconstitutional, he and many others say it's in the national interest.
We remain available to provide whatever support we can in a practical way, of course, to help our friends in PNG.
The Police Commissioner and officers are flying up to the conflict zone shortly as community leaders call for calm. Tim Swanston, ABC News, Port Moresby.
Israel has set a deadline for a fresh ground offensive into Rafah in Gaza's south, with fears for the estimated 1.4 million Palestinians sheltering there. From Jerusalem, here's the ABC's Global Affairs editor, John Lyons.
The crisis in Gaza looks set to escalate. A key member of Israel's war cabinet, Benny Gantz, has set a deadline now of Ramadan, March the 10th, by which all remaining hostages in Gaza must be released. Now there's about 1.4 million people who are crowding into Rafah, which is up in the south of Gaza, up against the border with Egypt. They've moved there because of the fighting in the north and the centre, and Israel had urged them to move away from the fighting. But now, if Israel is considering going into Rafah, then the great problem is what happens, where do those 1.4 million people go? President Biden has said there should be no incursion by Israel unless there is a credible evacuation plan. And the Norwegian Refugee Council is warning of a potential bloodbath. But Israel is making clear that it is intending to go into Rafah. It's surrounded Rafah already. It is making further preparations, and it is saying that there should be now moves for those people to evacuate.
And the World Health Organization says Gaza's second largest hospital is no longer functional after an Israeli raid. The military claims hundreds of militants were hiding in the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis in Gaza's south. The WHO says it wasn't able to enter the site to verify that information. The IDF released images of weapons it says were found inside, but Hamas dismissed the allegations as a pretext to destroy the healthcare system in Gaza. The WHO says there are still still about 200 patients in the hospital needing treatment. Supporters of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny are continuing to risk arrest by laying tributes after his sudden death. People dressed in black could be seen removing flowers from a makeshift memorial in St. Petersburg, but they were quickly replaced by new ones. Mr. Navalny died in prison where he was serving a 19-year jail term. His followers believe he was murdered on the order of President Vladimir Putin. Mr. Navalny's wife is expected to meet with EU ministers in Brussels in coming days, who say they want to honour her husband's memory. Hollywood stars descended on London for the British Academy Film Awards, dominated by Oppenheimer. The historical biopic about the man behind the atomic bomb won 7 of the 13 awards it was nominated for. Barbie, the biggest blockbuster of the year, and all the Australian nominees went home empty-handed.
I don't know if we can be trusted.
And the BAFTA goes to Oppenheimer.
A 3-hour epic about the creation of the atom bomb was the night's big winner.
Christopher Nolan.
Cillian Murphy.
Oppenheimer won 7 BAFTAs, including Best Picture, Director and Leading Actor for Cillian Murphy.
Let's make sure we're not the ones to make that possible.
The film, which earned more than $1 billion at the box office, dominated the Golden Globes and Critics' Choice Awards and has now cemented its status as the frontrunner for Oscar's glory.
Hi, Ken. Hi, Barbie.
Last year's top-grossing film, Barbie, and Australian actress Margot Robbie were again snubbed. It was nominated for 5 BAFTAs, but got none. Robbie, who channeled the doll on the red carpet, lost out to Emma Stone, who won Leading Actress for Poor Things.
Good evening.
Her brain and her body are not quite synchronized.
The Frankenstein-esque fantasy took 5 prizes.
I just thought that maybe I could help.
Australian Jacob Elordi from the psychological thriller Saltburn also missed out.
We still have enough votes.
With Robert Downey Jr. taking out Best Supporting Actor.
Maybe we've done all that we
He
can.
also missed out on the Rising Star Award along with Australian actress Sophie Wilde.
Talk to me.
It is no exaggeration to say this room has in it the greatest actors in the world.
The BAFTAs really are Britain's night of night when it comes to the world of cinema, and the awards handed out here are often seen as a good indication of what can be expected at the Oscars next month. Movie fans around the world will have been watching to see how their favourites fared. Guest of honour was Prince William in his role as president of the BAFTAs. He arrived without his wife Catherine, who's recovering from surgery. There were musical performances and a dog named Bark Ruffalo.
This is fine. This is fine.
The war has begun, and we have to tell its story.
But the razzle-dazzle took a backstage when a press team's account of the siege of Mariupol in Ukraine took out Best Documentary.
Conflicted, yeah, it's a huge honor. It's a huge responsibility, and we are so grateful for recognizing our work. But still, I keep thinking about Ukraine. I keep thinking about what is happening there right now.
With the glamour and the gongs of Britain's biggest night for films over, contenders are waiting to see if the Oscars will be a repeat performance. Michelle Rimmer, ABC News, London.
Russia has announced its forces have taken control of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine as Kiev's military chief announced the withdrawal of its troops. The city has been beset by fighting over the last 4 months. Video released by Russian state media showed tanks driving through the now destroyed city. Russia's defence ministry says its forces had also claimed full control of this Soviet-era fuel and chemical plant, at one point the largest producer in Ukraine.
Their command abandoned them. They had no communications. I would say the guys were new here, not knowing the terrain. The guys were confused. They were in panic.
Indian farmers have stopped their protest march 200 kilometres short of Delhi as their unions consider the government's latest offer. Demonstrators pushing for guaranteed minimum prices for their produce had clashed with police on their way to the capital last week. The government has since proposed minimum prices for specific crops with supply or demand issues, including corn and pulses. The farmers mainly grow wheat and rice, and their unions say they'll make a decision after reaching a consensus. Let's return now to Papua New Guinea, which has been rocked by the massacre of dozens in a tribal dispute. Our correspondent Tim Swanston joins us now. Tim, this has just been such an horrific story as it's unfolded. The death toll has been moving around. Do we know how many people have been killed?
Yeah, it has been absolutely a harrowing story. As far as that death toll, it has been. Police have been revising their number over the course of the day. Their current death toll is 49 at this stage. Initially, we did hear more than 50. They pared that back to about 26, but it appears that one of the challenges with this death toll as well is the number of bodies that they're finding in dense scrubland and bush. But at least at this stage, police say that their official toll is at 49. Now, they do say that most of those dead were working effectively as hired guns, and they were shot dead and killed in this absolutely dreadful tribal massacre. Prime Minister James Marape has said that he was deeply moved, very concerned and very angry over the massacre which took place yesterday morning.
Tim, do we know what set off this escalation of violence?
Look, we don't precisely know the cause of yesterday's massacre. What we do know is that tribal fighting has been, very common in that part of Enga province for really the last 2 years. Now, dozens were killed in tribal fights related to these tribes just middle of last year or so. Enga Governor Sir Peter Ipatas says that about 17 tribes have been involved in the recent tribal fighting. Now, what police have told us is that one tribe was preparing to effectively attack another. That's when they were ambushed. Now, as a result, we have seen the catastrophic death toll, so many dead. Of course, one of the real challenges here for police is the use of high-powered guns that are making their way into the region. There was a 3-month lockdown which was put in place last year, in the middle of the year. That was in an attempt to stop effectively the movement of guns into the region, but it appears that what we've seen that hasn't awfully been successful with the sheer access to firearms that many in these villages and communities still have. We did hear a statement from Mickey Kayok. He represents Wapanamandra in the National Parliament. He said that businessmen, leaders and educated elites are supplying guns, bullets and financing the engagement of gunmen. They must be identified and their business accounts thoroughly checked to substantiate their direct involvement. So we certainly know that there's appetite from parliamentarians to really try and crack down on those underlying issues, which is really supercharging the deadly violence.
Yeah, and to your point that, there's this sort of supply of these weapons makes it very difficult for the government to necessarily respond effectively.
Absolutely. It does present a fairly extraordinary challenge. Speaking to police when we travelled to the region last year, they said that they're effectively up against villages that are armed with a cache of bullets. This is a very perilous situation. Seeing, of course, some police communications today, some were saying, look, we aren't Superman, as far as standing in front of warring tribes that are firing at each other. That being said, though, we do know, of course, that police are trying to bolster their resources in the region. They've also been given greater police powers. They were also given this last year effectively shoot-to-kill powers when absolutely necessary. So additional police and defence resources are being sent to the region. Police Commissioner David Manning says that he is also going to be travelling too. We also know there's moves in the Parliament to try and effectively increase their domestic terrorism legislation. Of course, not only to give police greater powers, but also to increase penalties. So it is a very difficult situation as far as the resourcing of police, but they are trying in these ways to effectively, try and address some of these issues.
Yeah, and Tim, support has been offered from Australia. What might that look like? What would help the government there?
Yeah, look, I mean, Australia, of course, has offered and said that it is ready to support if needed. That's not necessarily an offer that's been taken up by PNG Prime Minister James Marape. He's more interested to see Australian support as far as the training that's been offered effectively as part of the bilateral security agreement that was signed between PNG and Australia just in December last year. So for him, it's more so a matter of Australian resources being used to train tactical units in PNG to try and then quell this violence. You know, Australia does have, of course, long-standing partnerships with AFP officers here, as well as Australian Defence Force here too. But as to whether or not actual direct assistance will be sought, it's unclear at this stage. We know Parliament is, Cabinet is likely to meet in the coming days to discuss this issue further in this escalated tribal fights, and certainly there are calls from PNG politicians for greater Australian support. So we'll have to see if that eventuates.
Tim, appreciate very much that update on a very difficult day. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
The Prime Minister Anthony Albanese concedes the arrival of a boat carrying asylum seekers to Western Australia is unfortunate, but not a failure of Operation Sovereign Borders. The battle over the arrivals has descended into a political tit-for-tat, with the PM rubbishing opposition allegations that the government has changed its border policy.
A battle over borders.
Well, the reason the boat got there is because the government has suspended or cancelled surveillance flights.
By definition, Peter Dutton's arguments are absurd.
Reignited by the arrival of 39 men on the shores of remote Western Australia on Friday via boat from Indonesia, now in immigration detention on Nauru, as political parties trade barbs.
They've ripped a cumulative $600 million out of Operation Sovereign Borders and Border Force.
A claim disputed by the government, with the opposition relying on projected rather than real funding, something which is topped up according to need.
Peter Dutton will continue to be a cheer squad for things that actually undermine our borders.
Except for temporary protection visas, which the Albanese government has scrapped, actual policy differences on boat stopping are largely rhetorical between the government and the coalition. Both agree on turning around asylum seeker vessels where it's safe to do so, and on offshore detention. They also agree on the relative secrecy of Border Force's operations. Nicole Hegarty, ABC News, Canberra.
Parts of northern China have been hit by severe sandstorms and heavy snowfall, leaving thousands of people stranded. A thick layer of yellow cloud is blanketing buildings and highways in several cities, leaving travellers no choice but to abandon their vehicles. In some areas, the sand and dust has reduced visibility to below 100 metres. Authorities warn the conditions could last for several days. China's first homegrown airliner made its international debut. The narrow-body C919, seen as a challenger to Airbus and Boeing's passenger jets, staged a flyby at the Singapore Air Show. It's made by the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China and has with 4 C919s currently in use by China Eastern Airlines. At the moment, it's only certified within China, but the company plans to seek approval from the European safety regulator this year. The worst floods in 60 years have left parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo underwater for months. The scale of the floods has experts calling for better management to prevent even bigger disasters in the future.
It's been almost a month since Cyprian Seka and his family had to flee their home.
We have lost all our property, our clothes, TV sets and other valuable goods. Now I'm here with my children and my wife in this Catholic church center that agreed to host us. But we are suffering.
They're some of the 500,000 people who have escaped rising waters since the Congo River hit a 60-year high in late December.
At this site, we have 400 households or 2,500 displaced people, and we offer primary healthcare through the health post.
The floods themselves have killed more than 200 people, but the water also brings other dangers, like typhoid and cholera, where the DRC accounts for 80% of all cases in West and Central Africa.
There's suffocation, you can't breathe. We're exposed to all kinds of diseases, even being infected. That's why we chose to sleep outside.
The capital, Kinshasa, is liable to flooding because it's downstream of one of the largest river systems in the world.
Every drop of rain that falls in the Central African Republic, Cameroon, Congo-Brazzaville, Angola, Zambia, Tanzania, countries that are next to the Congo Basin, ends up in Kinshasa.
And the risk of flooding is made worse by logging and deforestation upriver. Scientists are warning better plans need to be put in place before another flood devastates the capital.
It's urgent because the life of Kinshasa is truly threatened. There's an urgency for measures, an operational action plan, comprehensive flood management to be implemented in Kinshasa.
For those living in shelters, those measures can't come soon enough. Lauren Beldy, ABC News.
Well, as we heard earlier, supporters of prominent Putin critic Alexei Navalny are mourning his death. He'd survived poisoning attempts and spent years in some of Russia's most notorious prisons. Political scientist at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, Dr. Jan Matti Dolbaum, says the global outcry over Navalny's death will not faze the Kremlin.
I think it's not really going to be a problem for the regime at all. I think actually the gesture of laying flowers really speaks to the emotional state in which the opposition in Russia and the wider critical societies is right now. So this is not a collective action. I mean, people are going by themselves, maybe in smaller groups. Everything else would be permitted and repressed anyway. And so this really speaks to the atomized and depressed state in which Russian critical circles are in right now.
Yeah. Some people, though, have suggested that perhaps his death would galvanise the opposition in Russia. Do you think that's a possibility?
It is certainly it's a possibility. We cannot rule it out. I don't think it's quite likely, though, unfortunately. I mean, you have examples of events like this really producing a lot of anger in people, and that also maybe helps them to overcome their fear of repression. But I would think that in this case, that's not likely to happen. The fear is just very strong, and the dominating emotion right now is not anger, as I can perceive it from here. It's more despair and hopelessness, and that's exactly the thing that the regime wanted to create with this action, whether it was a deliberate murder attempt or not. But hopelessness is really something that the regime is very, very keen on creating in the opposition.
Yeah, and as you say, we may never really know the true cause of his death. You know, world leaders have been quite strong saying that Vladimir Putin is the man responsible for his death. Would you agree?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, this is a personalist authoritarian regime that has been created so that the person at the top, which is Vladimir Putin, has the power to intervene in most political decisions that are taken. And definitely the decision to lock up Navalny for so many years was something that was politically decided. And so whether this was a hit job in the prison or not, the responsibility is on the political leadership, definitely.
Yeah. I'm interested in what you see a situation like this and you wonder whether his decision to return to Russia to protest the regime was a wasted death in a way.
I think that he personally didn't really have a different choice. So he saw himself as a politician in Russia and not as a dissident who can influence affairs from outside of Russia. So he was really, he said that, and he had a big ego, but still, I think that is plausible that he had the urge to go back to Russia as soon as it was physically possible for him, and therefore, he also wanted to send a signal to his followers who remained in Russia, who were repressed very heavily as well. So he wanted to send a signal of hope and of courage that someone can actually survive this, and now he didn't, and that's why this is such a devastating signal for everyone who's still in Russia trying to affect some sort of change. So I as I said, he didn't really have a choice for himself, and that was the only logical thing for him to do.
But even if he viewed himself as a politician, he wasn't really able to impact the regime.
I mean, he couldn't have an impact in the democratic sense. The last time he was on a ballot was 10 years ago. I mean, you could also say only 10 years ago, because so much has changed since then. But he has, through his actions, brought out the authoritarian character of the regime. The regime was forced to react to his challenges in more and more brutal ways, if it wanted to survive as a regime, you could say. And it made certain decisions that made it much more brutal. It brought out this brutality. And so he did have an effect. It was clearly an unintended effect, and there were many other factors playing into that transformation of the authoritarian regime to such a brutal place. But definitely he was someone who was a threat to that regime, and that is the reason why he's dead now.
Yeah. What does this mean for other opponents of the regime? Some have even tried to get on the ballot, they've been disqualified, some others are in jail.
It means a continuation of this brutalizing trajectory that the regime is on. I mean, unfortunately, this wasn't really unexpected. It was perhaps unexpected that it came so early. I had hoped, as many others, that Navalny might be able to survive Putin, at least politically. That wasn't the case. But the death, unfortunately, under these torture-like conditions, wasn't really something very unexpected. And it is the case for so many other people who are locked up, whose name we don't see on Western TV screens. So this is unfortunately no news for anyone who's politically active in Russia. And that's why so many chose to go into exile and to just wait for better times. The regime, unfortunately, just has the violence, the power to just dominate everything. Even if the opposition were organized much better, it was very unclear whether they have any chance right now, because apparently the regime is ready to use force and is not caring about what anybody outside the country says about it. So they have lost apparently all sense of dignity and morality quite long ago.
Yeah. So, and to that point, as we've seen with Ukraine, is there any point in trying to impose further sanctions on Russia?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, that's possible. That's, ethically probably the right thing to do. It will not change anything inside Russia. I'm quite convinced. So we were thinking that the economic sanctions, which are pretty tough, would change things. They haven't. And anything else that the international community might be doing will probably only reinforce the sense of this embattled fortress that the Russian regime is trying to create in the population. So I'm afraid that Russia is too powerful to be forced into action by sanctions right now, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, but we should be realistic about their possible effects.
Really good to talk, Jan. Thanks very much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Former Thai leader Thaksin Shinawatra has met with prosecutors investigating a royal insult allegation. Authorities released him from hospital detention the day before, where Thaksin has been serving a corruption sentence. The royal insult complaint he discussed with prosecutors relates to a 2015 South Korean television interview. An Attorney General spokesperson says authorities need to investigate further before laying any charges, and couldn't act sooner as Thaksin was abroad until 2023. Thaksin has denied any wrongdoing. Avenida Brasil, one of Rio de Janeiro's arterial transit routes, is getting a facelift. More than 100 artists have been commissioned to bring colour to an otherwise grey part of the city for a new rapid bus corridor, and some are working unusual hours to try and make it happen.
Through the night, these artists block a freeway lane on the outskirts of Rio. On a cherry picker, they paint a mural, part of a mammoth art project touted as Latin America's largest.
We're bringing our work to the daily lives of people at a place that was very grey and dark.
Since December, artists have been bringing colour to the new 26-kilometre transit corridor for buses. They've been tasked with transforming every column and all 18 rapid bus stations, set to open soon.
This was done through public bidding. We made a databank of artists since we had more than 200 applications and 131 artists were selected.
So far, around 10,000 cans of spray paint have been used, plus 30,000 litres of paint. In a city known for its vibrant street art, it's a project that sees artists from embroiderers to tattooists happily make their mark on a scale much larger than their usual art practice.
Participating in such a large project and being able to inspire other people makes me feel gratitude and happiness.
They're hoping the change of scenery will bring a change of attitude too.
To me, being in the street and painting means revitalising spaces that were often forgotten. When the paint comes to a place like this, people start looking. It begins to have other uses. People value the place and feel better.
Buses will start running here soon, but no date is set. But for now, there's something to look at. Madeline Lobuth, ABC News.
Our top stories tonight on The World. Calls for Australian intervention in Papua New Guinea's highlands after dozens are killed in tribal fighting. Israel's leader vows to finish the job in Gaza as his troops get ready for an offensive in Rafah if Hamas does not free hostages by Ramadan. And Russian investigators yet to confirm the cause of Alexei Navalny's death as his supporters accuse Vladimir Putin of ordering him killed. Well, as we've just reported, Israel has set a deadline of March the 10th for Hamas to free remaining hostages, or it will launch a ground offensive into Rafah to hunt down Hamas fighters there. Professor Ben Saul is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counter-Terrorism, and he joins us out of Sydney. Good to have you with us, Ben. Israel has now set this deadline. Are there any issues for you with a deadline like this that's imposed when you've got nearly 1.5 million people sheltering there?
There's already an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and almost 1.5 million people are jammed into Rafah, a place which is designed to accommodate about 300,000 people. Most of the civilian infrastructure across Gaza has been destroyed: hospitals, sanitation, water supplies, food supplies. 30,000 people have been killed. Most of people in Gaza have been displaced, and half of the buildings have been destroyed or damaged. So regardless of the warning that Israel has given or whatever plans it might have for evacuations, there is no safe place in humane conditions for people to move to in Gaza at the moment.
Yeah. Israel has repeatedly said it will destroy Hamas. With your understanding of counter-terrorism, do you believe that is even possible?
I don't think it's possible because Hamas is a broad-based political movement. It's also the government, and although its fighters have undoubtedly committed all kinds of serious international crimes, including the continuing hostage-taking of innocent Israeli civilians, it's got deep roots in Palestinian society as a movement of resistance to the Israeli occupation, which has been going on for over 50 years now. So there needs to be a political solution. The UN Secretary General is absolutely right that Hamas did not rise in a vacuum, and those underlying political conditions that have been lingering for over 50 years need to be solved once and forever.
Yeah, it is so difficult, you know, in discussing this issue to separate Hamas from Palestinians. Many people feel that Hamas has either infiltrated and has many Palestinians working for them, or they are, I guess, holding the local population hostage to a degree. So how does one deal with that?
Well, Hamas has been a de facto government in Gaza. So it's no different than, for example, Russia being the government of Russia and also committing war crimes in Ukraine. I mean, these are complex political entities that do a whole range of different things. And under Hamas, of course, public services needed to run, government structures needed to keep going. And that was also a function that Hamas was performing. Now, clearly, the scale of international crimes committed by Hamas means that they need to be held accountable for those crimes. Individual members of Hamas who are involved in war crimes or crimes against humanity must be held to account, prosecuted, and punished and put in jail for those crimes. But that doesn't mean that the whole political movement behind Hamas has no role to play in a political solution. Just as in any other armed conflict around the world, there is usually some kind of political solution to bring about a transition from violence to peace.
Of course, I know that you've acknowledged that Israel has the right to respond to October 7th. How do you judge whether it has been proportionate when we look at how it is unfolding?
So international law sets some pretty clear standards on this. Israel, of course, has a right to protect its people from international crimes and other violence against civilians. But it has to do that in a way which is proportionate and which complies with international humanitarian law. And the problem is that clearly, and this is the view of all of the United Nations entities, it's the view of some national courts around the place, it's the view of the International Court of Justice, Israel has not been doing enough to spare innocent Palestinian civilians from the effects of hostilities. And clearly the scale of violence unleashed by Israel, indiscriminate attacks, disproportionate attacks, use of illegal weapons in some circumstances, use of dumb bombs not targeted in densely populated urban areas which cannot discriminate between Hamas fighters and civilians. All of that is not lawful under international humanitarian law.
How hard is it when it's so hard then to hold a country accountable in the middle of a conflict like this playing out?
Well, the international community has to step up. I mean, there are all kinds of tools available to other countries like Australia, whether that's bringing proceedings through the International Court of Justice, supporting the investigation of the International Criminal Court, through to unilateral measures like diplomatic protests to the Israeli government, imposing sanctions. I mean, why are countries like the United States and Germany and the UK and Canada still exporting weapons to Israel when we know that those weapons are very likely to be used in the commission of war crimes against civilians? So we have to step up. It's not just talking and criticising Israel in public statements. We have to make our displeasure with Israel meaningful by imposing concrete sanctions on the Israeli political and military leadership.
How do you sift through and how do you evaluate a scenario where on both sides, you know, there has been international laws broken?
This has been an incredibly dirty war on both sides. That's not to say that there is an equivalence between both sides, because each side is responsible for its own very serious violations of international humanitarian law. That's why we need independent investigations by independent, impartial international bodies, by bodies like the International Criminal Court, which is currently conducting an investigation. It's why all states, including their own intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and that includes here in Australia, should cooperate with the International Criminal Court. If any country has evidence of the kinds of violations that any of the parties have been committing, they should share that information with the International Court so that it can build a full picture of who is responsible for these crimes on both sides.
You talk about a negotiated settlement which needs to happen. Israel has made it clear it will not deal with Hamas, that Hamas cannot be at the table. How do you see a suitable solution being found?
Well, it's not just that Israel won't deal with Hamas. I mean, Israel will not accept a Palestinian state either, which, by the way, is what the vast majority of the international community has been calling for many decades, and which has been continually thwarted, not only by Israel, I mean, by the other side at times as well. So I don't think Israel is genuine about wanting to settle this conflict once and for all through a political solution which respects international law. I mean, to do that, you have to respect Palestinian self-determination. You have to recognise Palestine is entitled to become a state and should not continue to live under Palestinian occupation for a sixth decade, which is the current situation. Look at what's happening in the West Bank. It's clear that settler violence has been unleashed on Palestinians, killing over 300 people in recent months. The Israeli army is complicit in many of those acts of violence by settlers and is certainly not holding any of those settlers accountable in any kind of meaningful process. So I think the construction of the settlements tells you what Israel's agenda is. It is not serious about recognising a Palestinian state or a political solution to this conflict. It wants to hang on to Palestinian land as if it belongs to Israel, and that's illegal under international law.
Yeah. Before you go, I would like to ask you your thoughts about the death of Alexei Navalny. You know, what could the ramifications for a country like Russia be, which, you know, does not abide by, I guess, any of these sorts of judgments internationally, when an opposition leader dies in prison?
Well, the world has been unified in its condemnation of the death of Alexei Navalny, and we issued a statement this week calling for Russia to hold those accountable, those responsible accountable through an independent, impartial investigation. Now, of course, the Russian state is clearly not capable of doing that because it's not the kind of place which respects the rule of law and independent legal institutions. But other states can certainly do more. Australia has Magnitsky human rights sanctions available. Australia has used those sanctions pretty sparingly, I have to say, despite a world of very serious human rights abuses in many countries around the place. So we could tighten those sanctions. We've already got sanctions on Russia for Ukraine, but we could do more along with like-minded states to continue to isolate Russia, to put pressure on it that these kinds of unlawful deaths in custody potentially are not acceptable, particularly when it destroys independent political movements in countries. I mean, this is what it's about. It's about preventing any kind of political challenge to an authoritarian ruler in the person of Vladimir Putin.
Really appreciate your time, Professor Saul. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the Turkish Navy has released dive footage from what it says is a cargo ship that sunk off the country's coast last week. Rescue teams found debris strewn across the inside and fixtures that had come apart. Rescuers are still searching for the crew after finding an empty lifeboat on Thursday. Fires and fighting broke out in the Dutch city of The Hague on Saturday after an Eritrean community meeting ended with rival groups clashing on the street. Several cars and police vehicles were set on fire around the meeting location. The Hague issued an emergency order and has boosted police patrols in the area. New South Wales's asbestos saga has now crossed the border. The ACT's environmental regulator is now investigating the spread of potentially contaminated mulch. 7 more sites in Sydney have been added to the growing list of cordoned off areas. But one expert says the response is an overreaction.
The EPA's biggest ever investigation just keeps getting bigger.
It's put the government and the people of New South Wales in a very difficult position.
Bonded asbestos has been found in garden mulch at 7 more Sydney sites. 4 of them are public places and 3 are private land. Testing began at Domremy College over the weekend. It's the 5th school to return a positive test for asbestos.
I can't believe it. I've never heard of this before, and what can I say? I'm in shock.
I think it's just probably an accident and they'll clean it up.
Liverpool West public students had to squeeze into a nearby school today as their campus is cleaned up.
It's really busy actually. It is.
But it's a little nervous.
The EPA believes the mulch has come from Green Life resource recovery in southwest Sydney, and the investigation has now crossed state borders. The ACT government says a local landscaping supplier has sold mulch from the Sydney business to 27 addresses in Canberra.
So I don't want people to think that this is never ending. It's only one company that's suspected of the breach.
Authorities say the bonded asbestos being found is low risk because it's too big to inhale. According to experts, even wind and weather like this is not enough to create a health hazard.
So it's very hard to be able to actually generate a particle small enough that would be, less than 5 microns in size and get into your lungs.
The government's done almost 700 tests and ruled dozens of sites out of bounds, resulting in the cancellation of at least one major event.
From a purely risk-based perspective, yes, it is an overreaction.
3 more Sydney schools are awaiting test results overnight. Isabel Rowe, ABC News, Sydney.
Well, let's return to Russia, where supporters of Alexei Navalny have been risking arrest to lay flowers and attend vigils in his memory. They believe he was killed because he posed a political threat to the Russian president. The exact cause of his death has not been determined. Here's our Europe correspondent, Steve Kinane.
For many, Alexei Navalny was the last great hope for a democratic Russia. A charismatic anti-corruption campaigner and opposition politician who took on Vladimir Putin at great risk to his own safety. On Friday, it was announced he died at this Arctic penal colony where he was serving over 30 years for a series of charges, including extremism. Russian authorities say he died from sudden death syndrome. But 3 of the people who best know how Putin operates have told 730 they believe that Navalny was murdered.
I was horrified, of course, but unfortunately not surprised, because political assassinations is something Vladimir Putin has been doing for years.
The message from the Kremlin is, don't mess with the Tsar, because if you mess with the Tsar, you may die.
Putin's got an election coming up in the middle of March. He's scared to death that people aren't going to come out and support him. So what better way to make sure that he has no opposition than to kill the most important opposition politician in Russia, Alexei Navalny?
Within hours of the announcement of his death, Navalny's wife Yulia spoke at the Munich Security Conference.
Но если это правда, я хочу, чтобы Путин, все его окружение, путинские друзья, его правительство знали.
If anyone can understand what Navalny's family might be going through, it's Yevgenia Kara-Murza, whose husband, the opposition politician Vladimir Kara-Murza, has survived 2 poisoning attempts.
My heart goes out to Alexei's family, and I can imagine what they're living through right now, because I've been on the brink of that at least twice.
Last year, Vladimir Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years in jail for speaking out against Putin's war in Ukraine. And there are now grave fears about his safety as well.
I have been fearing for my husband's life every single day since at least his first poisoning in 2015. Any moment of any day of my life, the phone call might come.
John Sweeney is the author of Killer in the Kremlin, a book that documents what happens to Putin's critics.
Let's run through a few of them. Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Esmerova, Boris Nemtsov, Alexei Navalny. In order: poisoned, then shot, 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 poisoned, now dead.
He says in recent years, Navalny was seen as Putin's greatest threat.
He was everything Putin wasn't: physically brave, amusing, funny, charismatic, all of those things. And Putin hated him.
The reason Alexei Navalny had to be eliminated like that is because he, of course, represented a very strong alternative to Vladimir Putin and refused to back down, refused to be silenced.
Navalny first rose to prominence in 2011, protesting against electoral fraud and corruption and what he called Putin's party of crooks and thieves.
Alexei Navalny started exposing the corruption. He started fighting the corruption. He created YouTube videos about corrupt officials, and that platform grew and grew and grew. And he has millions of Russians, particularly young Russians, who say enough of this horrible stealing that's going on. We want someone fresh and young who will stop it. And that's what Alexei Navalny was all about.
He was barred from running for president, but continued to get under Putin's skin. After speaking out against constitutional changes that could have seen Putin remain in power for another 16 years, he was poisoned in Siberia in 2020. He collapsed while on a plane to Moscow, but survived after being evacuated to Berlin.
Konstantin.
A few months later, Navalny tracked down one of the security service agents involved in the operation to assassinate him.
And Navalny plays some Kremlin high-up, says, hello, tell me what happens, how did you do it? And the hapless poisoner spills the beans and says, we put the Novichok on the seam of Navalny's underpants.
The following month, Navalny decided to return to Russia.
At that moment, the Putin regime said, if you come back to Russia, we will arrest you, hoping that he will never come back to Russia. But instead, he got on that airplane, flew to Moscow, and was arrested when he landed.
A series of trials before Kremlin-controlled courts saw him facing decades in prison, and what ultimately became a death sentence.
And it shows what kind of man Alexei Navalny is. He cared more about the future of his country than his own personal security and his own safety. And he was ready to take a risk with his life and his liberty for his country.
Across the world, tributes have been paid to a brave opposition leader who wanted a better future for his country.
Make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death.
In Russia, hundreds of those commemorating Navalny's death have been arrested. And in this climate, Yevgenia Kara-Murza is worried that her husband and other political prisoners may not survive.
Now that the regime has killed its most prominent opponent, I believe that they will not stop before killing other people in Russian prisons.
Next month, Russia will hold what they're calling a presidential election. But with Putin's main opponents in jail, dead or barred from running, it's more like a coronation.
How many more people does Vladimir Putin have to kill before you get it? He is an enemy of everything we believe in: a democracy, fair play, free speech, common decency, having a laugh at people in power. Come on, this man is not our friend. We've got to stand up to him.
Australian Open champion Jannik Sinner has continued his winning form with a victory over Alex de Minaur in the final of the Rotterdam Open. Sinner won 7-5, 7-4 and is yet to lose to the Australian after 7 meetings. After winning 15 tour matches in a row, the Italian will rise to number 3 in the world. De Minaur will achieve a career-high ranking of 9 and was encouraged by his performance.
I played right now the best player in the world, right? On form and everything, and I was very close. Chances here, chances there.
Melbourne Cup winner Very Elegant has died due to complications giving birth to her foal. The mare won the 2021 Melbourne Cup with jockey James McDonald. It was one of 11 Group 1 race victories, which also included the Caulfield Cup and the Turnbull Stakes in 2020. Trainer Chris Wallace says Very Elegant will never be forgotten by those close to her and the wider racing public who followed her career. An Olympian's cheeky outfit for a costume competition has caused a stir in the equestrian world and beyond. 3-time Olympic medalist Shane Rose was stood down from competition after someone complained about him wearing a mankini on horseback. Late today, he was given the all clear.
It was bareback riding, but with a saddle.
That's Australian.
Shane Rose didn't mean to scare the horses when he entered a fancy dress competition at the Wallaby Hill Extravaganza.
I didn't win, but I was certainly in the finalists.
This was his original outfit, but he decided less was more.
Not the most comfortable equipment off a horse. And becomes less comfortable on a horse.
The discomfort wasn't limited to the veteran equestrian. One spectator was so offended they complained to Equestrian Australia, which launched an inquiry. But within the day, they concluded the code of conduct wasn't breached. The panel took into account the community event that Mr Rose was competing at and that Mr Rose had already made a public apology. It means the 50-year-old Olympic medalist has the all clear to compete in New Zealand next month, taking him one step closer to his 4th Games in Paris.
Yeah, I've got a very experienced horse that has to do a qualifying event in the 6 months leading up to the Games.
He's been fielding interview requests all day as his plight made global headlines and garnered widespread exposure for the sport.
I had somebody say, I've never been interested in horses, but this is the first thing that's actually got me interested in it.
Shane's now looking forward to the tail end of the Mankini mania. Carl Herr, ABC News.
Our top stories tonight, almost 50 killed in tribal violence in Papua New Guinea, with police saying they need more resources to tackle the problem. Israel says it'll begin an offensive in Rafah if all hostages are not freed by the 10th of March. And Russian investigators yet to confirm how Alexei Navalny died, as his supporters accuse Vladimir Putin of ordering him killed. That is your world for this Monday. You can watch the show on iView and head to our YouTube channel for more news and interviews. I'm Beverley. See you tomorrow.